Oscar Wilde is one of the most important authors of all time. We consider him to be part of British literature, even though he himself was of Irish origin. Today, I would like to focus on why this author is so admired and loved, and why he has always been so admired and loved. To answer that, I will briefly talk about his conceptions of art and beauty. Then I will move on to his masterly use of language, and we shall end with some of his observations of the human condition. Let's start with what Oscar Wilde has to say about art and beauty. Wilde is one of the authors who didn't just write, but also reflected, that is, thought about his own writing. While writing, Wilde asked himself, what is art? What is the role of the artist? And how should an artist create? What should be the product of his creation? We can find these answers in Wilde's essays, and they are also scattered in his other writings. So we can find the answers in his plays, in his novels, or in his fairy tales even. However, there is one work of art which is called The Picture of Dorian Gray, which starts with some Wilde's notes on writing in general. The Picture of Dorian Gray is a very famous novel which deals with a very interesting subject. The main character is a young, beautiful man called Dorian Gray, who has his painting, that is his portrait, painted by his friend and a well-known painter. Seeing how beautiful he is now in this painting, young Dorian wishes that he would always remain the same age and the same look. This wish is granted, but whereas his face and his body remain the same, the face and the body in the picture changes with his age, and even more, it changes with the horrible things he does during the whole novel, in the course of the whole novel. However, this is not the only thing the novel is about. The novel deals with general human themes like beauty, ugliness, and desire. Wilde's thoughts about writing can be found at the very beginning of the book, which we call preface. Here, Wilde writes, "The artist is the creator of beautiful things. To reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim." This means that artist shouldn't be writing about himself, or at least he shouldn't make it look like he's writing about himself. He should write and create beautiful things in general, and they should be considered to be beautiful, no matter who is the creator. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. Here, Wilde explains that morality is something that we can apply in our real lives, but we cannot apply morality in art. Books which are good cannot be considered to be immoral, because these are qualities which we can assess to human behavior, but not art in general. No artist desires to prove anything. Even things that are true can be proved. No artist has ethical sympathies. An ethical sympathy in an artist is an unpardonable mannerism of style. No artist is ever morbid. The artist can express everything. This implies that even when artists are writing about horrible, morbid, brutal, or immoral things, if the work is good and if there can be some truth found in the work, it is worth it and it cannot be considered to be immoral or bad. Thought and language are to the artist instruments of an art. Vice and virtue are to the artist materials for an art. Therefore, every artist should use the language with precision and perfection, and he can write about vices, ugly and despicable things, and virtues, beautiful and admirable things. But both of these are equal materials for an art. We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. All art is quite useless. This is the ending of the preface, and only after this, the plot, that is the main part of the picture of the Dorian Gray, starts. Now let's move on to Wilde's use of language. Wilde was a very prolific author. This means that he wrote a lot. He wrote novels, short stories, poems, fairy tales, plays, essays, letters, and also other genres. What is remarkable is that we can find a masterpiece in each genre Wilde wrote. Now, to show how Wilde uses language and why he's so good with it, I have chosen several quotes to demonstrate. There is only one thing in life worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about. We all hate when people gossip behind our backs and then when they say ugly and unpleasant things about us. But on the other hand, if people do not talk about it at all, it is equally unpleasant. There are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what one wants, and the other is getting it. Here, Wilde speaks about human desires, and unfortunately, this is the general way they work. We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. This is quite a cheesy quote, but it actually goes back to one ancient legend of a philosopher who was observing the stars, and during this he fell to the gutter. Wilde uses this story and says that the artists are people who are in the gutter, as we are all in this horrible and ugly world. But if we look on the stars, at the stars, we have a chance to become something more. The most terrible thing about suffering is not that it breaks one's heart. Hearts are made to be broken, but that it turns one's heart to stone. This is actually my favorite quote from Wilde's letter De Profundis, which we can translate as from the deep. Wilde wrote this letter while he was in prison, and in this letter he's thinking about his life, he's thinking about religion, and he's thinking about the human condition in general. This is one of the most difficult things to read by this author, but it is brilliant nevertheless. This also shows us that Wilde has these two sides. One is very sunny and cheerful, and the other can be quite gloomy and even dark. Wilde's life was quite complicated, and we don't have the time to dwell on it. But when she was 9. His sister Isola died, unfortunately, and Wilde wrote a poem for her. This poem is called Requiescat, and there are very beautiful lines. Tread lightly, she's near under the snow. Speak gently, she can hear the daisies grow. Wilde is giving us this image of his sister still being able to observe what is going outside. She's underground, she's in a coffin, but she can still hear what is going on outside. There is this saying in English that if someone dies and he's buried, he's pushing daisies. Daisies are these flowers, and he's like pushing them from bottom up. These two aspects of Wilde's work, the comical and the tragic, were unified in his famous, legendary last words. Wilde was staying in Paris, and in his room there was a wallpaper on the wall which he detested and he couldn't stand the sight of. As he was dying, it is recorded that he said, "This wallpaper will be the death of me. One of us will have to go." And finally, let's move on to Wilde's observations about the human condition. We can say that on one hand, Wilde's work is timeless. His focus on human relationships and human themes makes his work relevant for everyone. And we can be sure that people are going to be reading this artist as well. On the other hand, Wilde's writing is firmly based in the society and morals he lived in. This was the society and morals of Victorian England, which was very strict, very religious, and very rigid, focused on good morals, politeness, and everything had to be proper. Wilde, on the other hand, was sometimes on the, or rather, Wilde's writing was sometimes on the verge of becoming inappropriate and impolite. Now, this was also an issue for Wilde's own life, but several controversies were caused by his work. Here we can mention a play which is playfully dealing with Victorian morals and which is also fabulously amusing. This is one of the most famous works of Wilde in general. It's called The Importance of Being Earnest. In Czech, Jak je důležité míti Filipa. And it is a play with two main male characters, Algernon and Jack, and several interesting situations develop because of some exchange of identities. There are relationships involved with some spouses and also with mothers, and the whole play is reflecting the morals and habits of Victorian people. I have chosen several quotes which are a bit controversial. Algernon in Act 1 says, "Divorces are made in heaven." Now, this must have been quite hard on Victorian ears because, according to Christianity, divorces are not an ideal thing. They are forbidden, or we sometimes say that God cries when two people are divorcing each other. Jack, also in Act 1, says, "The only way to behave to a woman is to make love to her if she's pretty, and to someone else if she's plain." And finally, Algernon in Act 2 says, "I never travel without my diary. One should always have something sensational to read in the train," implying that his life is full of adventure and full of excitement, and writing about it is equally exciting as if one was writing some adventurous novel. However, Wilde's observations about human conditions are also more general, and this is true especially for the letter or essay which I already mentioned and which is called De Profundis. Here's another quote. To know oneself, that is the first achievement of knowledge. But to recognize that the soul of a man is unknowable, this is the ultimate achievement of wisdom. The final mystery is oneself. Here concludes my presentation about Oscar Wilde. I have mentioned several works in the presentation. I would especially recommend reading The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is one of the best novels ever written. And there are many other great works I haven't mentioned. I would definitely have a look on Wilde's fairy tales, and also some of his short stories are very amusing. It is ideal to hear Wilde's fairy tales when one is a child, to read The Picture of Dorian Gray when one is in his teens, and to read De Profundis when one is in his prime, that is, in the adult age. After that, you can just keep reading Wilde all over again, because everything he wrote is, or almost everything, is just brilliant. Finally, there are some sources, and I would like to end with one more recommendation. Please do read Oscar Wilde. It is definitely worth it.